what I'm going to talk about today is realism. Why not, right? So I'll start with the big stuff. And what I want to do, what I want to do today is examine some challenges to what we might think of as a strictly bottom-up or causal approach to scientific realism, and a strictly top-down or structuralist approach to scientific reasoning. I'm not going to elaborate those very much, just to locate them in the space of arguments about how scientists are warranted, or what goes into the warrant for claiming that some phenomenon is real. So are emergent phenomenon real? Are emergent, in this case, emergent robustness in biology, in biological systems real? And I'm going to suggest an alternative to those two approaches that have been on offer, and suggest that, in fact, what warrant is itself something that is an interactive coherence account that requires different ingredients, including the causal interactions of experience or experiment, including the theoretical presumptions of particular models of phenomena, and including specific conceptions of what counts as causality. So that's kind of the general, oh, I should go to my outline. That's the general picture. And so here's what I'm going to do. And I'm just going to be, I'm not going to presume you know everything that I've ever written about everything, because I've been around a long time. I'm not sure I even remember everything I've written about everything, but I'm going to locate this excursion into realism and in the framework that I live in terms of my presumptions about scientific knowledge, scientific practice, and metaphysics. And then I'm going to walk through this argument about bottom-up versus top-down inferences to the reality of phenomena, introduce this third way, which is I'm still looking for a name, but it's an interactionist account that appeals to affordances inspired by some of the work of J.J. Gibson, who is an ecological psychologist. Don't worry, I'll tell you what you need to know about that. And then look at and then test this out. Show, in a way, the order of the talk is not the order of my investigation here, because I've been working on emergent phenomena, collaborating with scientists on trying to understand how system level properties arise and are maintained in the dynamic interactions of the components of a system. I've worked on honeybee dynamics. I've worked on protein folding, on behavioral genetics and psychiatric disorders. There's a lot of context in which robustness and emergence are located in biology, and I have arguments about what that is too somewhere else. Okay, but I think this case of emergent robustness exposes these ingredients, as I'm calling them, that are all required in order to warrant a claim that this case of emergence is real, this phenomenon is real, and that phenomenon that was purported, say, mesosomes, you don't need to know the details, turned out that scientists decided they weren't real, that they were artifacts in some way. So what goes into that warrant, I think, is what we do in kind of constructing the real. It's a methodological approach to determining how that warrant occurs. I see myself as a descendant of Carnap, who I think some people think does conceptual engineering. So in that regard, I'm going to take over that language too. Okay. So the conclusion is, how do we conceptually engineer what is real? Okay, what goes into that kind of process in science, my location. So here's the inside of my brain. Okay, here are the kinds of ways I think about issues in philosophy of science, and looking at what the coordination, if it was maybe a better designator, the coordination of the kinds of ontological assumptions made in science that contribute to the kind of knowledge we can have of nature, right? and that are generated by the kinds of practices that scientists engage in. So for me, I have three domains I have to answer to, right? All of these things, I move back and forth through these spaces, looking at specific scientific practices, saying what assumptions must be in place ontologically, exposing what the epistemological features are of that practice, seeing what that implications of that are for practice, what the implications are for epistemology, etc. So my general method of work, if you like, is to move through these different kinds of constraints on the structures for having scientific knowledge. So that's kind of it. And in that excursion, I think there's a lot of things that are important, but for today, I want to, let's look at the epistemology. One of the things that's been driving both my defenses of integrated pluralism as a description of the practices of science is a feature about representations themselves, the kinds of representational, the representations that are the models, theories, descriptions that constitute communicable knowledge. So here are the basic pieces of my story that will come to play in this example. All scientific representation models are partial. I mean, it's against a certain form of completeness. If you have complete knowledge of everything, then, you know, there's no need to do science, right? But humans doing science represent the claims made about nature in many different forms, whether they're in natural language, whether they're mathematical, whether they're via simulations or graphical models. All of these are the things that scientists are trying to claim represent nature and represent the world, so that we understand the triumvirate that you want to be able to explain, predict, and intervene in nature. That's the goals of science, and those goals shape the kinds of practices scientists engage in. But to do that, we scientists in their all the representations are necessarily to be useful partial. And the kind of completeness I'm rejecting here is this kind of representational one-one mapping kind of correspondence. You can't have that. And I just refer you to Borges's story on the exactitude of science for a literary argument here. But you can't have it without having a full-scale duplicate of the phenomenon, which doesn't help us understand, explain, predict, and intervene. So partiality is essential to representations. The flip side of that is that for every account of a phenomenon that leaves things out, so partiality is a form of abstraction, the flip side is, what does it leave in defines a kind of perspective of what are the features that are thought to be relevant to represent, encodes what's left in. Sometimes what's left in is a feature of decisions by scientists to focus on certain kinds of causal factors. Sometimes what's left in is itself a perspective that's constrained by the representational medium. There's lots of, it's not always an intentional perspective, right? And again, I won't, yeah, I could spend 2 weeks talking about this, so I'm going to move on. Okay. And so this kind of the partiality and the perspectival character of representations generate consequences for practice. Namely, I don't see complete models as the goal of science. So instead, you're going to see islands of local unifications, not a general global unification process in scientific practice. And you're going to have moments of partial reduction. There are relationships where different representational models stand in a reductive relationship, but not all of them are. So I'm an anti-reductionist, anti-unificationist, and that's what gives rise to this picture of integrated pluralism. Now, just on the ontological side, briefly, that you know, many people have made this argument about compositional materialism or physicalism being the grounds for reductionism in the practice end of the picture, but notice it doesn't survive moving through this epistemological claim about partiality. You can have an ontological claim, which I think is constitutive of scientific practice, that appeals only to substance monism, materialism, or physicalism. But every representation that is a candidate for scientific knowledge is itself partial. And so whether that representation is here's the short story. Physicalism is not equivalent to physicsism. Physicsism is about the representations that are generated by the study of certain parts of and aspects of nature. And it's just as partial as the representations of the physical substance as it is formed into biological structures, right? They're equally partial, and they're not, the ontology doesn't support, it doesn't entail a kind of reductive relationship between the units of knowledge, the representations that scientists develop. Okay, so, but I believe in compositional materialism. It doesn't lead me to reductionism. I believe that real phenomena have causal effects. So there's a causal assumption here about how we interact with nature as a way of getting knowledge about nature through experience and experiments. And I'm going to say that my ontology, and I'll tell you about this later, also includes what I'm calling Gibsonian affordances, which is an interactive way of grasping, of constructing what is in nature through its interaction with the actor or the perceiver or the scientist or whatever. Okay. Models can be more or less accurate, however they accommodate the accepted empirical data, right? We can make those judgments, but they also can be more or less adequate. And that's, well, how well they serve different pragmatic goals. So I'm a 3P picture. It's partial, perspectival, and pragmatist approach to understanding scientific knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to talk about just the last part of this today, the affordances move that I'm developing now. So this is new stuff for you. I've been talking about it. You may have heard me talk about it. Coming out soon, one hopes. Okay. All right, so here's the question for today. What are the phenomena? What is real? Okay, when we engage in scientific interactions with nature through experiment and experience, what can we say as a result of those interactions? What inferences are warranted to claiming that what we've identified is the actual real phenomenon, namely it's real in having the kinds of causal, allowing the kinds of causal interactions that experiments do, and it's real in terms of the kinds of representational accounts of it, right? What the thing is that's real is what's in our representation. Okay. All right, so let's just start with Bogan and Woodward, two colleagues and teachers of mine who wrote a very influential picture to try to identify what they call phenomenon. So we're going to use their notion of phenomenon, not Duhem's or Copernicus's, or this is a shift in or Kant's. This is a shift in what the phenomena are. So what I want to locate it in this space of descriptions. So Bogan and Woodward, everybody knows since the 16th, 17th century that science has adopted an empiricist foundation, that experiments and experience are used to judge the truth, if you like, of propositional claims of science, or the accuracy of models of science. It's all done through the empirical engagement, right? So they wanted to make a distinction about, and there's lots of accounts of this, but Bogan and Woodward make a distinction between phenomena and data. They want to say phenomena are detected through the use of data, but in most cases are not themselves observable. They talk about what the melting point of lead is, right? You can't observe that. You can interact with bits of lead in a laboratory. You can generate series of data that have different measurements of what that is, but you don't get this kind of direct, it's, even though the word data in Latin comes from the given, It isn't given, it's got, right? It's made. So they think phenomena are detected through the use of data, but in most cases are not observable, and that phenomena have stable, repeatable characteristics, which will be detectable by means of a variety of different procedures, which may yield quite different kinds of data. And this idea about so here's what I draw from that. That if you have phenomenal stability, phenomena, the things in the world that are detectable, if you like, and which have, if they are stable, then they're detectable by either replications of the same experiment or different kinds of experiments. And if the detections are reliable, then you will generate convergent data. And this has been one in philosophy of science, one of the major strongest claims or evidence for realism is when you have very different experiments all giving you the same results. That is taken to be evidence that you are actually detecting something that's out there, that's real. Okay, it's not because the idiosyncrasies of different are the systemic biases, if you like, of each of the different experiments. How it would be a miracle argument story if they all gave you the same results when there wasn't anything there that they were detecting. Okay, so this is what's evidence for realism, this phenomenal stability plus reliable detectors, right? Giving you convergent data. That's one of the main arguments for realism. So here's a kind of version of their picture, which I modified from Daniela Byler-Jones' account of their picture, that in fact, there's two different kinds of interactions that generate this argument for realism, this convergent argument for realism. One is the inferential relationships between a theory or model, which make predictions about the phenomenon. And the other is the causal relationship between the phenomenon and the data, which occurs in kinds of experimental detections, right? You put the protein inside a big magnet, you see you do various things to it, and from those interactions you can infer from the causal interactions a model of the data that you can then compare to the predicted data from the theory. So this is a more elaborate, clearly a more elaborated account than the old chestnut of propositional logic accounts, that if H is true and the auxiliary assumptions are true, then I predict that when I put conditions C in place, I will see effect E, right? And then do the logic of inferences. If I get to C, if in fact I set up my experiment and I generate E, then that's confirmation. If I set up my experiment and I don't see what was predicted, that's falsification of the propositional hypothesis. So logical frameworks about how support occurs for theoretical claims is well known. This is a slightly more elaborated one already, if we can talk about this in the work of Duhem. All right, so the question is, how do we use this causal interaction of experimentation as justification for what's real, what goes into that story? So one of the issues that comes up, and this is generated in part by a kind of paradox that I'm not sure I would really call it a paradox, but that Anjan Chakrabarty proposed. Let's see if I can get his quote, which is that, oh, here it is. He quotes that it's a dilemma. He said, realists face an apparent dilemma. The thinner their interpretations, the easier realism is to defend, but at the cost of more substantial commitment. The more substantial their interpretations, the more difficult they are to defend, right? And so in a way you want to say, what are the inferences that warrant my claim that this phenomenon, chemotaxis in E. coli, is real, is from data, the inferences from data to the phenomena that are based on causal interactions. What I can infer from that is that something exists that causes the data pattern that I'm observing in these many cases. This is sometimes called entity realism. This has been defended by people like Nancy Cartwright, Ian Hacking, that what I can claim is real, if I could, Hacking famously said, if you can spray it, it's real. Namely, if I can get these causal interactions to line up correctly, to converge, to then I know there's something real there, right? I'm not making any literal claim about its properties other than it's something that can cause the data patterns that I'm witnessing. Then there's the other inferences, which is a more substantial account of what's real from theory to phenomenon. You find this in Defenses of Structural Realism. I have an account of how the world works in my theory. It predicts what I should observe, right? And when I observe it, then I want to infer that the structures, the relations described in my theory are what's real. Okay. So the precisely described relations and properties exist that cause the data pattern. So there's a kind of what Chakravarty later calls a top-down and bottom-up approach, right, to inferring to the real. Bottom-up is that causation is the foundation of justifying what's real. Real phenomena cause our experience. They generate data in different types of experiments, and we infer that there are real phenomena from this kind of relationships among data, this first step out of the causal interaction. And the top-down approach says that structural relations are the foundation of what is real. This argument works better when you have mathematical models of phenomena, because the mathematical models are the structures that you then want to say are in the world, that are really in the world. And real phenomena are the things that are isomorphic to those mathematical relations in our best theories. Okay, so we infer the real phenomena from our theories, and you can infer more details even if you don't want to read them literally. So here's my problem. Whenever I meet a dichotomy, it kind of makes me nervous, right? And then it makes me irritated, and then it makes me say that's not right. So what do I want to replace this kind of top-down, bottom-up? And you can see you can read through these debates between these positions, and it's like, it's clear that they're taking as grounds for what constitutes the real very different types I'm going to just call them ingredients because that's my today's favorite word for this. Okay, so what do I want to say in response to that? I think why do I have to pick one of those? I think you need both top-down and bottom-up approaches in order to establish the real. And I want to suggest that that's a result of that's parallel to some of the arguments that J.J. Gibson gave about how organisms interact with and represent the world in order to achieve their goals, right? So in a way, what I want to say is that there's not just entities and there's not just structures, there's both, right? And we need to we get support for claiming the reality of some phenomena by using both the methods of top-down and bottom-up. But how do we do that? And here's a way of how to do that, which is an affordance interactionist approach. Okay, so real phenomena are things that are sufficiently stable to afford both detection in the causal bottom-up way and representation in the structural top-down way. Okay, scientific knowledge isn't just causation. I can't just, smack the table and say that's a science, that's knowledge, right? Knowledge requires both the representability and the detectability, right? Both the causal and the representational. Okay, so again, I said this is pluralist, perspectival, and pragmatist. It's top-down and bottom-up simultaneously. So here's J.J. Gibson, who was interested in perception. What do organisms perceive in nature and in their kind of partial perceptible uptake of what nature's like? And I won't show you the pretty slides of what a bee sees and what we see, given our perceptual apparatus are different, even pointing at the same flower. The same flower looks different to humans and to bees because we detect different wavelength structures in nature. Our causal apparatus varies, right? each of those is partial, each of those is perspectival. So what Gibson says, he says that affordances are properties taken with reference to the observer. Okay, so this is interesting, right? I hope you think so. I think so. Here's his quote from 1977. He said, "The affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes either for good or ill. The verb to afford is found in the dictionary, but the noun affordance is not. I, J.J. Gibson, have made it up, right? I mean by it something that refers to both the environment and the animal in a way that no existing term does. It implies the complementarity of the animal and the environment." So what's really going on here is that, well, let me read you another quote from Gibson. What's going on here is that what the environment is independent of the animal, right? But what it affords to the animal is mediated through the ways in which the animal can detect and interact with it, right? So the fact that there are, maybe we think we have good evidence for the reality of the quantum level of matter, right? But typically birds don't interact with quantum level differences, right? What they interact with, what generates their behavior, are things that are detectable to them. So their world, right, their perspectival partial account of the world is generated through what's out there in conjunction with what they can both detect and what is relevant for the kinds of behaviors they engage in. All right, that's the story here. Here's another quote from him. "An important fact about affordances of the environment," so the affordances are out there, right, in the environment. "The affordances of the environment is that they are in a sense objective, real, and physical. Okay. Unlike values and meanings, which are often supposed to be subjective, phenomenal, and mental." This is Gibson. "But actually, an affordance is neither an objective property nor a subjective property, or it is both, if you like. An affordance cuts across the dichotomy of subjective, objective, and helps us understand its inadequacy." Yes, I say to that. That sounds right to me. Let me translate Gibson into scientific realism. Okay, here we go. Here's my interpretation, right, of affordances are properties, entities, structures taken with reference to a conceptual framework. Okay, so the affordances of real phenomenon are what they offer the scientist, what they provide or furnish to experiment and representation. I mean by it, me, Mitchell, something that refers to both the causal properties in nature and the representational framework of the scientist. It implies the complementarity of both in establishing what is real. So it's this kind of affordance interaction account that I think is what is the methodology, if you like, of engineering what is real. Real is out there and in here, out there and in our representations, right? And it's the complementarity of those that gives us warrant for claiming something is real, right? Not just causally bumping into things, not just sitting around coming up with mathematical structures. You need them both. Okay, so this is the kind of picture I'm trying to draw with this, and let's see what happens. Let me give you some philosophical argument and evidence for why I think you need both of these. Okay, so let's go back to bottom-up realism with Woodward's invariance criteria for causality. So if we say that I need to the causal interaction is part of the story, how does that work? Well, here's one picture of how causality is interpreted. And given I'm using Woodward and Bogan's data and phenomena, let's look at his account of causality. This is his interventionist account of causality, very bottom-up-ish, right? In the sense that C causes E if and only if there's some intervention that changes the value of C, such that if that intervention were to occur, the value of E or the probability distribution of E would change. Okay, this is, if you are happy or think of Mill's methods, it's a kind of a statistical conditional probability account of intervention, right? I know more about what's in nature if I can intervene experimentally and see what the results are, right? Okay, there's lots of problems in trying to do that well, but that's the goal, right? If I can causally intervene, science will, the nature will expose to me, right, what the causal properties are. And causation is one of the things that is an identifier bottom up of what is the real. Okay. Actually, there's having been teaching about experiment this semester, Francis Bacon talks about it's not enough to just go and look at nature, but you have to grab the lion by the tail. Okay. Make the lion do something so that you can see what its causal capacities are. Okay, so but this is a well-known picture, so I'm not going to elaborate it, but just to say that causal invariance requires that under some changes, the relationship described as C causes E is invariant, right? So if I intervene, I see that if I intervene on the temperature of, if I increase if I increase, well, I don't want to give too many examples. Okay, so let me just say this. So Bogan and Woodward claim that data is the causal evidence for phenomenon, remember in that earlier part? And what it means to have causal evidence is that if you could intervene on it, you would see that there's an invariance in the relationship between C and E as you increase the temperature, change the pressure, right? Remove certain parts of it, whatever. That relationship against invariant will give you evidence that it is a causal relationship. Okay, so what I extract from this story is the following. What I'm interested in is what's a real phenomenon. So real phenomena are things that are stable enough to have interventions on, right? And that can be reliably detected and give rise to convergent data. Okay, that's the evidence structure for the bottom-up real phenomena and reliable detectors give you convergent data, and that data then supports some theoretical models and fails to support others. Okay, so that's again just rehearsing that relationship. But now we know what it means to be real. Notice that one of the critical pieces of Woodward's account is that it's no longer the case that causal relationships are only those described by strict laws of universal exceptionless connection, right? To be a cause for Woodward, you don't have to have universal invariance, only invariance under a range of interventions. Okay, so the fact that the ideal gas law, the relationship between pressure, temperature, and volume, right, holds for the most part, right? It doesn't hold when you get down to temperatures of absolute zero, right? That's okay. It's still a causal relationship because there's a range of interventions, changes in the variable of temperature, under which that really holds. That relationship between pressure, volume, and temperature holds. That's a causal relationship, even if it fails in these exceptional cases, right? Absolute zero. So he's rejecting a universalist, exceptionalist, lawful account of causation. And that's important because as you'll see, you have to have some view of causality in order to do the other pieces of the story of how you warrant realism. Okay. So let's go to what the emergent phenomena are. Are emergent phenomena real? Well, emergent phenomena are really both ubiquitous and problematic for certain conceptions of causal interaction. So Kitano famously claimed that robustness is a property that allows a system to maintain its functions against internal and external perturbations. That's a kind of basic notion of robustness. It has been one of the sources for the development of systems biology to suggest that to understand what's going on in a complex system of a composed system, you can't just look at what parts are there, but you have to look at the way in which those parts interact to generate higher level phenomenon. And I have defended elsewhere that those higher level properties of the system also have downward causal effects on its components. So this is this emergent robustness, right, is picks out a particular class of dynamic systems in nature, right? The brain's like that, honeybee colonies are like that, protein foldings like that, chemotaxis in E. coli is like that. There's a lot of things that do this, right? It's not a weird thing. It's like everywhere. Okay, so how do we understand it? It's a relative context dependent notion. A system is robust with respect to certain functions and outputs, right? Under certain types and ranges of perturbation and to varying degrees. So you can't engineer a biological system to, except I guess cockroaches are close, that are robust against any temperature change, any other kind of change, that systems are able to restore or maintain their functioning, even if they're heated up too much, or even if they're involved in, heating up. I guess with global climate's always on my mind. So this is, when things heat up a lot, systems break down. Okay, and some systems are robust to that perturbation, and some are more robust, etc. Okay, so how do they restore or maintain system function in the light of these perturbations, right? Heat it up or go in and traumatically injure part of the brain reorganizes to respond to that. How do they do that? It's achieved by flexible architectures, not by dedicated architectures. Okay, so it responds, it adapts, it repairs, it modifies. Okay, so it does this through self-organization and emergence. Perturbations, but because perturbations, in this again in biology, ubiquitous, are not predictable, this flexible responses have emerged on demand. You need to respond to what is the perturbation today. You didn't evolve to, it wasn't around in the past for you to have a fixed response to. Instead, this flexible architecture, this interaction, dynamic interaction of self-organization on demand from the mutual interactions of the parts, is the way in which robust emergence happens. Okay. I was going to give you complicated. I'm going to give you the simple example because, it's a talk, right? There's complicated stories, and I was working one up on chemotaxis and E. coli, and I thought, no. Okay, let's do the simple one. I've used this before, and this one really illustrates the kind of interventionist logic that's supposed to tell you when you've got a stable, causally invariant phenomenon, therefore real from the bottom up. And this is a little bit old technology, but what is this technology? Well, it's genetic engineering, it's knockout experiments. Knockout experiments, I mean, John Stuart Mill could have written the book on knockout experiments, right? You create a system in order to be able to expose and compare two organisms that are identical in every respect except one, right? Okay, so you intervene on these organisms, you create, and this is how you do it. We now have CRISPR, we now have more targeted genetic modification techniques to use to explore what relationship, what genes are causally responsible for what traits. Those are the questions it's asking typically in medical context. So you create these clone mice so that you knock out one gene that you think might be responsible for producing, I don't know, tumor production, for producing diabetes, whatever you think it is, right? Producing skin color, right? You knock out that gene, and you then, if you're lucky, the organism survives. And if you're even luckier, it'll reproduce with other knocked out organisms, and you get this double mutant, right? So you get this ideal controlled experiment. You have the normal, semi-normal lab mice. You compare it with which you didn't do anything to, and then you take the double mutant knocked out mouse, which is just like the normal mouse, except for in this one place, the genes silenced, right? Okay. And then you say, okay, what looks different? I can attribute that to the gene. So this is about genetic causation. But as it turned out, in about 30% of knockout experiments, there wasn't much difference. Okay. All right. So if it's a cause, then it shows a difference. I did it, and there wasn't much difference. And so what was supposed to be the conclusion? And it turned out that scientists gave two very different inferences from the if you like, the failure of knockout experiments to expose causal differences. Mario Capecce, who invented this technology, said, well, I don't believe in complete redundancy. If we knock out a gene and we don't see something, we're not looking at it correctly. There's something unreliable in this experimental setup. We didn't do it right. Okay, that was his response to a failed confirmation. But other people like Robert Weinberg, who's a famous cancer geneticist, said with respect to these failed knockouts, the big surprise to date is that so many individual genes, each of which had been thought important, have been found to be non-essential for development. I guess they didn't do anything, right? Okay. They made two different inferences about the failed causal experiment. One is it was unreliable, and the other is, I guess the purported gene wasn't really causing the effect we thought. But there was a third, but this response was unsatisfactory. And here's the third option. This is by Ralph Greenspan, who suggests, no, what happens when you perturb the genetic system in this way, right, is a robust response, right, is a restructuring of the genetic network, right, to compensate for the perturbation to its internal condition, right? So when you knock out a gene, it's not that everything has one job, right? But rather that things that did have a sort of functional job now acquire new jobs, new interactions, new responses. And again, there's cases in traumatic brain injury and reassignment of neurons. These are cases that are all over the place. So instead of so what happens in a robust emergent system is when you try to intervene in order to expose the invariances in its causal interactions, the whole thing changes on you, okay? So this is kind of a problem of how you use a bottom-up strategy for establishing the real phenomena that are causing the effects in nature and causing the effects in my experiment, right? Okay, so this is the kind of problem context. So what do we do about that? Well, how stable must a phenomenon be to be real? That's the question. Remember, we have to have phenomena. It has to be stable enough that we can detect it, right? Okay. And stable enough that it's invariant in the Woodward causal picture, right? But how stable must it really be? And where do we locate that stability? So here's a kind of, just because, you know, PowerPoint gives you certain limitations of representation, a kind of representation of that. If you think that, let's look at the big end of the arrow. If you think that causation requires universal dependence exceptionlessness, right? Okay. Then the only kinds of, then the stability you need is something like you get in the melting point of lead. There's almost no conditions in which that melting point changes, right? There's almost no perturbations you can do to lead. Okay. Not so with the brain. So you might have, okay, so maybe my notion of causality might require me to have absolute exceptionless invariance, okay? In which case then what I get to call real is pretty limited in nature, okay? I might have a different account of how invariant, maybe it has to be high probability dependence for most cases. Early Woodward talked about this as kind of what he meant by laws, but, you know, so it's kind of, it's not just, you know, it's not random. Okay, random, yes. Random relationships aren't causal. But so there's some high probability. So maybe the ideal gas law, you know, it's highly probable that the dependence holds for most places, most cases, right? Just a few that it doesn't hold for. Or maybe what we have is these highly context dependent invariances, right? What's invariant is very much a response to changing conditions, right? And this is the case of emergent phenomenon. So how much stability do we need in the phenomenon to say it's real for it to be detectable and representable as a cause? Okay. What's the degree of convergence that constitutes reliability? Okay, so how do I know that my detection device is reliable, which I need if I'm going to rely on the, if I'm going to use it to make the inferences to realism? Well, do I expect all data processes will give me the exact same measurement? No. Okay, that would be really too strong an account of of convergence, right, to say it's reliable. I mean, we don't do that in any experiments. We average if we think if there's random noise, we average if we think it's systemic reasons why I'm getting different measurements when I do a protein experiment with X-ray crystallography rather than nuclear magnetic. I use those systemic differences to explore the space of reliability. So we don't expect all the data processes to be exactly the same value. And the stories about Perrin and the measure of Avogadro's number, I just don't believe they were exactly the same. Okay, all right, but that's a historical question I haven't investigated. Well, maybe you think that multiple data sets give you the same value. Okay. And that's in general what we use for convergence as reliability. Replication crisis is about this kind of convergence or reliability testing, right? But maybe it's difficult to repeat unique experiments or required to get a measurement or a value. And so are we not going to count those experiments as reliable? These were early cases of gravitational waves. Nobody could replicate them. Nobody could get them. We needed big fancy equipment, etc. So it strikes me that the degree of convergence of reliability is also a kind of a continuum, just as the invariance is a kind of a continuum. So what you need is that if data from different types of experiments converge, then you infer the phenomenon is real. That's the kind of standard, anti-miracle argument, right? If data from different types of experiments diverge, then what do we do? Okay, right? Well, you could say one or more experiments is not reliable. This is the Capecci response to knockout experiments. You can say there's not a real phenomenon there. That's the Weinberg response to the knockout experiments, right? But there's a third option. You can say there is a real robust phenomenon, right, that has different causal effects in different contexts, right? So the fact that, so what does this require from us in terms of establishing what is real, right? It requires us to have a coordination of these ingredients that go into this argument, right? You don't need complete or even wide context insensitivity for reliability, right? The degree of reliability you need has to match the type of phenomenon you're trying to detect. Okay. So here's the conclusion. Yay. You need to match the appropriate notion of reliability with the kind of stability you get in these different kinds of phenomena. Robust phenomenon, obligate phenomenon. They have different requirements for what is going to be stable enough to give us the grounds for making inferences from convergent and divergent data. Okay. What counts as reliability in the data that is generated by and provides inferential support for a phenomenon is dependent on the degree or type of causal stability of the phenomenon. So I was suggesting that you can have robust phenomena whose causal relationships have a different kind of stability than the atomic requirements for melting point of lead. Reliability is always reliable for, not reliable to core. So this experimental setup is reliable for detecting these kinds of stabilities, right? A conceptual framework of causation is also required. If I think causation is degrees of invariant, but not universal exceptionlessness, right? That's going to shape the account of reliability that I need for a stat, and it will chunk out different decisions about what's real. Then if I think I can have causal invariance that isn't universal, then so if I get divergence, it's not going to throw out the realism conclusion I would otherwise draw. Okay, so again, so it is kind of metaphilosophy, not just metaphysics. It's more metaphilosophy about what are the pieces in a conceptual framework that shape the methods of establishing a warranted claim of realism. Okay, a conceptual framework of causation and a theory of the type of phenomenon is required to specify the appropriate form of reliability for data to support claims of phenomenal realism. So it turns out to do bottom up, right? Realism, you need both an account of causality and a theory of the phenomenon, okay? It doesn't look so bottom up anymore, right? So what kind of data are evidence for a real emergent phenomenon? My problem case for Bogan and Woodward, you need reliable convergent data. Reliability is independent, they claim, I didn't go into this, of the theory of the phenomenon, right? It's just about the experiment, theory of the experiment. I don't need to know about the phenomenon to know that my experiment's real. Not so, according to me. Okay. The divergent data must imply that there's no phenomenon, or it's an artifact, or it's unreliable, right? Okay. Mitchell's, that's me, says that you can have reliable convergent or divergent data. And I've done some other work on divergence arguments. Divergence can be due to flexible, context-sensitive causal behavior. It's still real. It's still causal, right? It just behaves in ways that don't generate always convergence, right? Standards for reliability are relative to the kind of phenomenon and the theory of the causation, the other ingredients. So real phenomena are sufficiently stable to afford both detection and representation. There's different types of phenomena, there's different degrees of stability, and there's different criteria for reliability. Real phenomena, here I'm going to say, are engineered jointly from the bottom-up causes and the top-down theories within some philosophical account of causation. And with that, I'm going to say thank you.